The saloon door swung open just as Violet Ashford noticed the young woman at the corner table carefully breaking her biscuit into smaller and smaller pieces, eating every crumb except the very last one, which she wrapped in a threadbare handkerchief and tucked into her worn coat pocket. It was October 1882 in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the gambling town had seen its share of desperate souls passing through on their way to somewhere better. But something about the deliberate way this woman saved that final morsel struck Violet straight through the chest. She had golden hair that caught the lamplight despite being pulled back in a simple braid, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded the cloth around that precious last bite. Her dress had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches, and her boots were held together with what looked like leather strips cut from an old belt. Violet had been a ranch hand and occasional cowboy for the better part of 6 years, ever since his father died and left him the small spread 15 miles outside town. At 24 years old, he had weathered his share of hard seasons, knew what it meant to stretch supplies thin, but he had never gone truly hungry. Something about this woman's quiet dignity as she preserved that last bite told him everything he needed to know about her circumstances. He walked over to her table, hat in hand, his boots making soft sounds on the sawdust-covered floor. Up close, he could see she was younger than he had first thought, probably around 21 or 22, with eyes the color of summer grass and a delicate face that spoke of better days. She looked up at him with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "Excuse me, miss," Violet said, keeping his voice gentle. "I could not help but notice you dining alone, and I was wondering if you might allow me to order you some supper. The stew here is quite good, and the cook makes an apple pie that is worth the price of admission." The woman's cheeks flushed pink, and she straightened her shoulders. "Thank you kindly, sir, but I have already eaten." Her voice was soft but educated, with a slight accent he could not quite place. "I saw what you had," Violet said quietly, pulling out the chair across from her without sitting. "And I am not offering charity. I am offering company and a meal between two people who happen to be in the same establishment at supper time. My name is Violet Ashford, and I would be honored to know yours." She studied him for a long moment, her green eyes assessing whether he was sincere or simply another man with ulterior motives. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she finally nodded. "Grace Jennings." "I suppose I cannot claim to be full when I clearly am not." Violet sat down and waved over the barkeep. "2 bowls of stew, a loaf of bread, some butter, and 2 slices of that apple pie. Also, bring a pot of coffee if you have any fresh." Grace opened her mouth as if to protest the quantity, then closed it again. Violet noticed her hands were clenched in her lap, and he suspected pride was waging war with hunger inside her. "I came to town to hire some help for the ranch," Violet said, filling the silence with easy conversation. "Roundup season is coming, and I cannot manage it all alone." "You been in Las Vegas long?" 3 days, Grace said quietly. "I came by stage from Santa Fe. I was hoping to find work here, perhaps as a seamstress or a cook, but most establishments want experienced workers or those with references." "Where are you from originally?" Violet asked as the barkeep set down 2 steaming bowls of stew thick with beef and vegetables. Grace picked up her spoon but hesitated before dipping it into the bowl. "St. Louis. My father was a banker there. He died of pneumonia 2 years ago, and my mother passed 6 months later from grief, I think. I had an aunt in Santa Fe who wrote and said I could live with her, but when I arrived, I discovered she had died the previous winter. Her house had been sold to pay debts. I had just enough money for the stage ticket here." Violet felt his chest tighten at the quiet resignation in her voice. She spoke of these tragedies as though they were simple facts, but he could see the pain lingering in her eyes. "I am sorry for your losses. That is a heavy burden to carry." "We all have our burdens," Grace said, finally taking a spoonful of the stew. Her eyes closed briefly at the taste, and Violet saw her throat work as she swallowed. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, but he noticed she was already calculating, already determining how much she could eat and how much she should save for later. "Eat it all," Violet said gently. "There is more coming." "I could not possibly. You can, and you will," he said, his tone firm but kind. "And you are going to take that last bite out of your pocket and eat it too, because I am going to make sure you have plenty more where that came from." Grace's eyes widened and her hand unconsciously moved to her coat pocket. "You saw that." "I did. And it told me everything I needed to know about your character. You are a survivor, Grace Jennings, but you should not have to survive alone." She looked down at her bowl, and Violet saw a tear slip down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. "I am not accustomed to accepting help from strangers." "Then let me not be a stranger. Tell me about St. Louis. Tell me about your life before all this happened." And she did. As they ate their way through the stew and bread, then the apple pie and coffee, Grace told him about growing up in a comfortable home with parents who loved her, about the piano lessons and the garden her mother kept, about the books she had read and the dreams she had once had of seeing the world. Violet listened, asking questions, sharing his own stories about the ranch and his father, about learning to break horses and mend fences, about the endless Nevada sky and the way the desert bloomed after rain. By the time they finished eating, the saloon had filled with evening customers, and Violet realized hours had passed. Grace looked more relaxed now, the tension in her shoulders eased by a full stomach and genuine conversation. "Where are you staying?" Violet asked as they stood to leave. Grace hesitated. "There is a boarding house on the north end of town. The landlady allows me to sleep in the storage room in exchange for washing dishes and cleaning." Violet felt anger kindle in his chest at the thought of this educated, gentle woman sleeping in a storage room, but he kept his voice calm. "I have a proposition for you. My ranch needs help. The house is too big for one person, and I could use someone to cook and keep things organized. I can pay $30 a month plus room and board. It is honest work, and you would have your own room with a proper bed and a lock on the door." Grace stared at him. "You do not even know me. How do you know I can cook or keep house, can you?" Violet asked. "Yes. My mother taught me, and I ran our household after she became ill." "Then that is settled. I will not force you to accept, Grace, but I am offering you a place where you will be safe, fed, and treated with respect. Nothing more than that unless you want there to be." She searched his face again, and Violet held still, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I would like to accept your offer, Mr. Ashford, but I insist on proving myself. If my work is unsatisfactory, you must tell me." "Deal," Violet said, extending his hand. She shook it, her grip firmer than he expected, and he felt something shift in his chest at the contact. They left the saloon together, and Violet walked Grace back to the boarding house so she could collect her few belongings. The landlady seemed relieved to see her go, which made Violet even more certain he was doing the right thing. Grace emerged with a battered carpet bag that looked like it weighed next to nothing. "Is that everything?" he asked. "Everything I own in the world," she said with a wry smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Violet had stabled his horse at the livery, and he collected the bay gelding before boosting Grace up into the saddle. She rode in front of him, stiff at first from the proximity, but as they made their way out of town under a canopy of stars, she gradually relaxed against him. The desert air was cool and clean, scented with sage and dust, and the horses' hoofbeats provided a steady rhythm. "Tell me about the ranch," Grace said quietly. "It is not much," Violet admitted. "About 500 acres, maybe 200 head of cattle. The house is adobe with a wooden roof, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room. My father built it himself when he first came west. There is a well with good water, a barn, and a few outbuildings. It gets lonely out there, I will not lie about that. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, but it is peaceful and the land is beautiful in its own way." "It sounds wonderful," Grace said, and he heard the longing in her voice. "I have not had a real home since my parents died." "You have one now," Violet said, and meant it. They reached the ranch just before midnight. Violet lit a lamp and showed Grace around the house, which was spare but clean. The furniture was simple, handmade by his father, and the walls were bare except for a few shelves holding books. He led her to the bedroom that had belonged to his parents, which he had not been able to bring himself to use after his father died. "This room is yours," he said, setting the lamp on the dresser. "The bed has clean sheets and there is water in the pitcher. The lock works and I will be in the room at the end of the hall. The kitchen is stocked with supplies and you can help yourself to anything you need. In the morning, I will show you around the property." Grace set down her carpetbag and turned to face him. In the lamplight, she looked very young and very tired. "Why are you being so kind to me, Mr. Ashford? You do not know anything about me beyond what I have told you." Violet considered his answer carefully. "I believe we know each other when we see them struggling, even if we do not know their names. I saw you save that last bite, and I knew you were someone worth knowing. As for the kindness, I am just treating you the way anyone should be treated. With dignity and respect." "Not everyone sees it that way," Grace said softly. "Then not everyone is worth your time." Violet moved toward the door, then paused. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow is a new day and I promise you, you will never have to save your last bite again, not while I am around." He left her then, closing the door gently behind him, and made his way to his own room. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about the look in Grace's eyes when she had wrapped up that last piece of biscuit. He thought about the pride that kept her spine straight even when her stomach was empty, and the way her smile transformed her tired face into something beautiful. Violet Ashford had never believed in love at first sight, but he was beginning to suspect he had been wrong about that. The next morning, Violet woke early as always and made his way to the kitchen to start coffee. He found Grace already there, wearing a faded apron he recognized as having belonged to his mother, flour dusting her hands as she worked dough on the wooden counter. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a shy smile. "I hope you do not mind that I started breakfast. I found eggs in the cold room and some bacon. The bread should be ready soon. Mind." "I cannot remember the last time someone made me breakfast," Violet said, pouring himself coffee from the pot she had already brewed. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Grace admitted. "A real bed with a real mattress is a luxury I had almost forgotten." They ate breakfast together as the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. Grace had made fluffy scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and fresh biscuits with honey, and Violet ate with genuine appreciation. He noticed she still hesitated before taking seconds, and he made a mental note to keep encouraging her to eat her fill. After breakfast, Violet showed Grace around the property. He introduced her to his horses, including a gentle mare named Daisy that he thought she might enjoy riding. He showed her the chicken coop, the vegetable garden that had gone somewhat wild without proper tending, the root cellar stocked with preserves and dried goods, and the barn where he kept his tack and tools. "It is a lot to manage alone," Grace observed as they walked back toward the house. "It is," Violet agreed. My father had hired help, but after he died, I could not afford to keep anyone on. I have been doing my best, but some things have fallen by the wayside. I could help with the garden, Grace offered, and the chickens. My mother had chickens in St. Louis, and I used to tend them. That would be helpful, Violet said. But I do not want you to feel like you have to work every moment. This is your home now, not just a place of employment. Grace looked at him with those clear green eyes. You are a very unusual man, Mr. Ashford. Violet, he corrected. Please just call me Violet. Violet, she repeated, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. And you must call me Grace. Grace, he said, testing it out. It suits you. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace proved to be an excellent cook and housekeeper, but more than that, she brought life back to the ranch house. She sang while she worked, hymns and folk songs in a clear, sweet voice that made Violet pause whatever he was doing just to listen. She tended the garden with care, coaxing the neglected plants back to health and planting seeds for the spring. She gathered eggs each morning and baked bread each afternoon, filling the house with warm, yeasty smells that reminded Violet of his childhood. For his part, Violet made sure Grace never went hungry. He hunted regularly, bringing back rabbit and quail for her to cook. He bought supplies in town each week, always getting a little extra, and he noticed that Grace was beginning to lose that gaunt, hollow look she had worn when they first met. Her cheeks filled out, color returned to her complexion, and her eyes grew brighter. But more than the physical changes, Violet noticed Grace beginning to relax. She laughed more readily, offered her opinions without hesitation, and sometimes in the evenings they would sit together in the main room and talk about everything and nothing. She told him about the books she loved, and he brought her volumes from town. She asked about ranching, and he taught her to read the weather and the land. She wondered about his life, and he opened up in ways he never had with anyone else. 6 weeks after Grace arrived, Violet came in from mending fences to find her in the kitchen making stew. She was humming to herself, completely absorbed in her work, and he stood in the doorway just watching her. She had flour in her hair and a smile on her face, and Violet realized with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with her. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That smells delicious, he said, announcing his presence. Grace turned, her smile widening. I am trying something new. I found some herbs growing wild near the creek, and I thought they might add flavor. I am sure it will be perfect, Violet said, crossing to the basin to wash his hands. Everything you make is. You are too kind, Grace said, but he could see she was pleased by the compliment. They ate dinner together as the sun set, and afterward, Grace brought out the checkerboard Violet had found in a trunk of his mother's things. They played 3 games, with Grace winning 2, and Violet found himself more interested in watching the way she bit her lip when concentrating than in actually winning. You let me win that last one, Grace accused, setting up the pieces for another round. I did not, Violet protested, though his grin gave him away. You did. You left your king completely exposed, she pointed at the board. No one who knows how to play would make that mistake. Maybe I was distracted, Violet said without thinking. By what? Grace asked, looking up at him. By you, Violet thought, but he could not quite bring himself to say it out loud. Not yet. Instead, he said, by trying to determine whether you might like to learn to ride. I thought maybe this weekend, if the weather holds, we could take the horses out. I could show you some of the prettier parts of the ranch. Grace's face lit up. I would love that. I have never been a strong rider, but I always enjoyed it. Daisy is gentle, Violet assured her. She will take good care of you. That Saturday dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for riding. Violet saddled both horses and helped Grace mount Daisy, adjusting her stirrups and making sure she was comfortable. They set out at an easy pace, following a trail that wound through scrubland and up into the low hills that marked the edge of his property. Grace was a natural rider, despite her claims of inexperience. She sat tall in the saddle, her body moving with the horse's rhythm, and Violet found himself thinking how right she looked there, framed against the endless sky. He took her to his favorite spot, a small canyon where a spring bubbled up from the rocks and created a little oasis of green in the desert landscape. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and wildflowers grew in the damp soil near the water. They dismounted and let the horses drink while they sat on a flat rock overlooking the spring. "This is beautiful," Grace breathed, looking around with wonder. "I never imagined the desert could have places like this." "Most people think the desert is empty and dead," Violet said. "But if you know where to look, it is full of life." Grace turned to look at him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for everything, Violet. You saved my life, you know. I do not think I could have survived much longer in Las Vegas." "You would have found a way," Violet said. "You are stronger than you think." "Maybe," Grace said softly, "but I am glad I did not have to. I am glad I met you." "So am I," Violet said, and before he could overthink it, he reached out and took her hand. Grace's fingers curled around his, and they sat like that for a long moment, not speaking, just being together in that peaceful place. Violet wanted to tell her how he felt, wanted to pull her close and kiss her, but he sensed the time was not quite right. She had been through so much, lost so much, and he did not want to rush her or make her feel obligated because he had helped her. So instead, he simply held her hand and watched the water sparkle in the sunlight, content to wait as long as she needed. As autumn deepened into winter, Violet found more and more excuses to be near Grace. He taught her to shoot, placing tin cans on fence posts and standing behind her to adjust her stance, acutely aware of her warmth and the scent of lavender soap she used. She taught him to cook beyond his basic trail skills, showing him how to make pastry and season meat properly. They worked together to prepare the ranch for winter, stacking firewood and checking the barn for leaks. The first snow came in late November, a light dusting that made the desert look like something from a fairy tale. Grace stood on the porch watching it fall, and Violet came up beside her with a blanket, draping it around her shoulders. "It is so quiet," she said wonderingly. "In St. Louis, snow meant slushy streets and coal smoke. This is different. Better or worse?" Violet asked. "Different," Grace repeated. "But I think I prefer it. Everything out here feels cleaner somehow, simpler." "It can be harsh too," Violet warned. "Winters can get cold, and sometimes we get snowed in for days at a time." "That does not sound so terrible," Grace said, glancing up at him. "Being snowed in with good company." Their eyes met, and Violet felt the tension between them shift into something more charged. He stepped closer, and Grace did not move away. The snow fell softly around them, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breath, could feel his own heart pounding. "Grace," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I know you came here looking for work, for a place to stay, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about that for me. You have become the best part of my day, the reason I hurry through my chores. I find myself thinking about you constantly, wondering if you are happy, hoping you might feel even a fraction of what I feel for you." Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment, Violet thought he had made a terrible mistake. Then she reached up and touched his face, her hand cold against his cheek. "I feel it too," she said. "I have been afraid to say anything, afraid you were just being kind and I was misreading everything. But Violet, You have given me more than a home. You have given me hope again. You have made me feel valued and cared for, and somewhere in all of that, I fell in love with you." Violet felt his breath catch. "You love me." "I do," Grace said. And then she was rising on her toes and he was bending down, and their lips met in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. They stood there on the porch, kissing in the snow, and Violet thought he had never experienced anything more perfect. Grace's arms came around his neck, and he pulled her closer, careful and gentle but unable to hide the depth of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard and grinning like fools. "I love you," Violet said, because now that he had started, he could not seem to stop. "I love you, Grace Jennings, and I want you to stay here not as my housekeeper but as my wife, if you will have me." Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Are you proposing to me, Violet Ashford?" "I am," he said. "I know we have not known each other long and I do not have much to offer, but I promise I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you have more than enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough love. You will never have to save your last bite again, never have to worry about where your next meal is coming from. I will take care of you, Grace, if you will let me." "Yes," Grace said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife and your partner, and together we will make this ranch into a real home." Violet kissed her again, tasting salt from her tears and sweetness from her smile. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, and he thought about that first night in the saloon when he had seen her save that last bite of biscuit. He had known then, on some level, that she was going to change his life. He just had not realized how much. They were married 3 weeks later in Las Vegas, with the preacher from the small church officiating and a handful of townspeople serving as witnesses. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Violet had bought her as an early wedding gift, and he wore his best suit, brushed clean and pressed. She looked radiant as she spoke her vows, her voice clear and strong, and Violet felt his throat tighten with emotion as he slipped his mother's wedding ring onto her finger. Afterward, they had a meal at the same saloon where they had first met, and Violet made sure Grace had more food than she could possibly eat, piling her plate high and encouraging her to try everything. She laughed at his attentiveness, but he could see she was touched by it too. "You do not have to feed me quite so much," she teased. "I am not going to fade away." "I know," Violet said, "but I made you a promise and I intend to keep it. You will always have more than enough, Grace. Always." They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife, and Violet carried Grace over the threshold of what was now their home. That night, they made love for the first time, slow and careful, learning each other's bodies and hearts. Grace cried afterward, and Violet held her close, understanding that these were tears of release, of all the pain and fear she had carried finally being washed away. "I never thought I would be this happy again," she whispered against his chest. "After I lost my parents, after I arrived in Santa Fe and found my aunt gone, I thought I was destined to spend my life alone and struggling. But then I saw you walk into that saloon, and everything changed." "I saw you trying to be invisible," Violet said, stroking her hair. "Trying to take up as little space as possible. But Grace, you deserve to take up space. You deserve to be seen and loved and cherished, and I am going to make sure you never forget that." Winter passed into spring, and Grace bloomed like the wildflowers that suddenly carpeted the desert. She was happy in a way Violet had never seen before, singing constantly, smiling at everything, throwing herself into making their house a home. She sewed curtains for the windows and made rag rugs for the floors. She planted a larger garden and started raising more chickens. She learned to help with the ranch work too, riding out with Violet to check on the cattle and proving herself capable of mending fences and doctoring sick animals. But more than the work they did together, it was the life they built that mattered most. They had their routines and their private jokes, their quiet moments and their passionate ones. Violet continued to make sure Grace had plenty to eat, and it became a kind of love language between them. He would bring her extra biscuits at breakfast, put the biggest piece of meat on her plate at dinner, save her the last slice of pie. And Grace, understanding what it meant to him, would accept these offerings with grace and gratitude, sometimes feeding him bites from her own fork in return. In the summer, they made improvements to the ranch, building a new chicken coop and expanding the barn. Violet hired a few hands to help with the roundup, and Grace cooked for all of them, massive meals that the men praised lavishly. Violet watched with pride as his wife laughed and joked with the hired help, completely confident now in a way she had not been when they first met. One evening after the hands had ridden back to Las Vegas, Violet and Grace sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Grace had her head on his shoulder and his arm was around her waist, and everything felt perfect. "Violet," Grace said quietly, "I have something to tell you." He looked down at her, catching the nervous excitement in her voice. "What is it?" "I am with child," she said, placing her hand over her stomach. "The baby will come in late winter, I think." Violet felt his heart expand so much he thought it might burst. "Grace, that is wonderful. That is the best news I have ever heard." She looked up at him with shining eyes. "You are happy." "I am beyond happy," he said, kissing her soundly. "I am going to be a father. We are going to be parents. Our child will grow up here on this land with all the love and security we can give them. They will never go hungry," Grace said softly. "They will never have to save their last bite." "Never," Violet agreed. "They will grow up knowing they are cherished and wanted just like their mother." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered from sickness in the early months, and Violet fussed over her constantly, making her rest and bringing her weak tea and dry toast. She complained that he was being overprotective, but he could see she appreciated his care. As she grew larger, he took over more of the heavy chores, insisting she focus on her health and the babies. In February 1884, during a cold snap that frosted the windows and made the desert floor crunch underfoot, Grace went into labor. Violet rode hard to fetch the doctor from Las Vegas, and then spent the longest night of his life pacing outside their bedroom, while the doctor and a midwife he had brought attended to Grace. He could hear her cries through the door, and every sound made him want to break down the barrier and be with her. But the midwife had been firm about him staying out. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard a new sound: the strong, angry wail of a baby. Violet's knees went weak with relief, and moments later the midwife opened the door with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Ashford, a big, healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully." Violet rushed into the room to find Grace propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a red-faced infant wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was like the sun coming up. "Come meet your son," she said. Violet approached reverently, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking down at the tiny person they had created. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a surprisingly strong grip when Violet offered his finger. He felt tears running down his face and did not bother to wipe them away. "He is perfect," Violet said. "You are perfect. Grace, I love you so much." "I love you too," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We did it, Violet. We made a family." They named him Thomas after Violet's father, with the middle name Edward after Grace's father. Thomas was a healthy, hungry baby who cried lustily when he wanted something and slept soundly when he was satisfied. Violet doted on both mother and son, continuing to ensure Grace ate well and rested as much as possible while recovering from the birth. Watching Grace nurse their son, Violet was struck by how much had changed in less than 2 years. The thin, desperate woman who had saved her last bite of biscuit was gone, replaced by his confident, healthy wife. The lonely cowboy who had eaten meals in silence was now a husband and father with a noisy, chaotic, joy-filled home. As Thomas grew from an infant into a chubby, smiling baby, Grace regained her strength and energy. She proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, but also firm when needed. Violet helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Thomas when he was fussy at night, changing diapers without complaint, and playing with him endlessly. He had never known his heart could hold this much love. The ranch prospered too. With the money they made from selling cattle, Violet was able to make more improvements and even buy additional land. He hired permanent help, 2 good men who built their own cabins on the property and worked year-round. Grace became friends with one of the workers' wives, a cheerful woman named Martha who had 3 children of her own and loved having another young mother nearby. Life fell into a new rhythm, busier and louder than before, but Violet would not have changed a thing. He still made sure Grace had plenty to eat, now expanding that promise to include Thomas. His son would never know what it was like to go hungry, never understand the desperation that had driven his mother to save that last bite. When Thomas was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she remained active almost until the end. Their daughter was born in early autumn, a tiny, dark-haired girl they named Sarah Grace after both their mothers. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Violet and Grace's hearts expanded yet again to encompass this new life. The years passed in a happy blur of birthday parties and cattle drives, of teaching Thomas to ride and rocking Sarah to sleep, of building a successful ranch and a loving home. Violet sometimes thought back to that night in the Las Vegas saloon and marveled at the path his life had taken. One moment of noticing, one decision to reach out, and everything had changed. Grace flourished in ways Violet had hardly imagined possible. She was confident and strong, a full partner in running the ranch, a loving mother and a passionate wife. The shadows that had haunted her eyes when they first met were gone, replaced by contentment and joy. She still remembered those hard times, though, and she was generous with others who struggled, always the first to offer a meal or a helping hand to anyone in need. When Thomas turned 5, he started asking questions about how his parents had met. Grace would tell him the story, simplified for his young ears, about how she had come to Nevada looking for work, and his father had been kind enough to give her a job and a home. "But I think your father knew from the moment we met that we were meant to be together," Grace would say, winking at Violet over Thomas's head. "I did," Violet would agree. "I saw your mother and I knew she was someone special." As the children grew older, the story became more detailed. Thomas and Sarah loved hearing about the saloon and the biscuit, about their mother saving that last bite, about their father's promise to always make sure she had enough. "You saved Mama," Sarah would say, cuddling up to Violet. "No, sweetheart," Violet would correct gently. "Your Mama saved herself. I just helped her find her way home." But Grace would shake her head. "We saved each other," she would insist. "I gave Violet a family to love, and he gave me the security to flourish. That is what love is supposed to do." The ranch continued to grow and prosper. By the time Thomas was 10 and Sarah was 8, they owned over 1,000 acres and ran 300 head of cattle. They had built a larger house with proper bedrooms for everyone, a parlor with Grace's cherished piano that Violet had bought her one Christmas, and a modern kitchen with a new stove. The original adobe house became a bunkhouse for the hired men. Violet hired a tutor for the children, a young woman from back east who taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history. Both Thomas and Sarah were bright students, curious about the world beyond their ranch. Violet and Grace encouraged their education, knowing that knowledge would give them choices in life. Life was not without its challenges. There were drought years when the grass grew sparse and they had to sell cattle at a loss. There were harsh winters when they lost livestock to cold and wolves. There was the year Sarah came down with scarlet fever and nearly died, with Grace and Violet taking turns sitting up with her for 3 weeks until the fever finally broke. There were disagreements and frustrations, moments when Violet's protectiveness clashed with Grace's independence, times when the stress of ranching and parenting threatened to overwhelm them both. But through it all, they held onto each other. They remembered what they had come from and what they had built together. And Violet never forgot his promise. No matter how tight money was or how difficult things became, he made sure Grace and their children always had more than enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough love, enough security to know they were valued and cherished. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Violet took Grace back to that little canyon with the spring, the place where they had first held hands. The children stayed with Martha and her family, giving Violet and Grace a rare day alone together. They rode slowly, both of them more skilled riders now, comfortable in the saddle after years of ranch work. The canyon was just as beautiful as Violet remembered, perhaps more so with the afternoon sun slanting through the cottonwood trees and making the water sparkle like diamonds. They dismounted and sat on the same flat rock where they had sat all those years ago. Grace leaned against Violet's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. 10 years, Grace said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know what you mean, Violet said. Sometimes I still see that young woman in the saloon trying so hard to make one meal last. Other times, I cannot remember what life was like before you. Do you have any regrets? Grace asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Not a single one, Violet said firmly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace. You and our children, this life we have built together. I would not change any of it. Even the hard parts, Grace asked. The drought, Sarah's illness, all the times we barely scraped by, even those, Violet confirmed. Because we went through them together and they made us stronger. I am proud of what we have built, Grace, not just the ranch but our family. Our children are happy and healthy and kind. That is because of you. Because of us, Grace corrected. You set the example, Violet. Your generosity, your kindness, your unwavering support. Thomas and Sarah learned those things from watching you, and they learned resilience and strength from watching both of us work through challenges. Violet kissed her temple. Do you remember what I promised you that first night? That I would never have to save my last bite again, Grace said with a smile. That you would make sure I always had more than enough. Have I kept that promise? Violet asked. Grace pulled back to look at him directly, her green eyes serious. You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible. You saw me at my lowest moment when I was broken and desperate, and you offered me dignity and hope. You gave me a home and a family. You gave me love that has never wavered, not even in our hardest times. You have kept your promise 1,000 times over, Violet Ashford. Good, Violet said, his throat tight with emotion. Because I plan to keep it for the rest of our lives. They stayed at the canyon until sunset, talking about their memories and their dreams for the future. They discussed Thomas's interest in expanding the ranch, and Sarah's surprising talent for drawing. They talked about maybe taking a trip to St. Louis someday, so Grace could see her old home again, though she insisted it would only be a visit because Nevada was where her heart belonged now. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, Violet felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. This was what he had always wanted, even before he knew to want it. A partner to share his life with, children to raise and love, work that mattered, and a home filled with laughter and warmth. The children were waiting on the porch when they arrived, Thomas trying to appear grown up at 10, but unable to hide his excitement at his parents' return. Sarah dancing on her toes and chattering about everything she and Martha's children had done that day. Grace gathered them both into her arms while Violet took care of the horses, and when he came back to the house, he found his family sitting down to a dinner that Martha had helped the children prepare. It was not fancy, just simple stew and biscuits, but it was served with love and eaten with gratitude. Violet watched his children eat heartily, never hesitating over food, never calculating how to make it last, never having to save anything for later. They ate until they were full and then asked for seconds without a trace of shame or worry. It was exactly what he had wanted for them. After dinner, they sat together in the parlor. Sarah begged Grace to play the piano and she obliged, filling the house with music. Thomas sprawled on the floor with a book, and Violet sat in his favorite chair, watching his family and thinking about all the moments that had led to this one. Time continued its steady march forward. Thomas grew into a capable young man who worked alongside his father on the ranch, learning every aspect of the business. He had Violet's steady temperament and Grace's sharp mind, a combination that served him well. Sarah developed into a talented artist whose sketches of ranch life and desert landscapes attracted attention when Grace showed them in town. She had Grace's determination and Violet's kind heart. When Thomas was 18, he began courting a girl from Las Vegas, the daughter of a merchant. Violet and Grace approved of the match, seeing genuine affection between the young couple. When Thomas asked his father's advice about proposing, Violet told him about that first night with Grace, about the biscuit and the promise. "The most important thing," Violet said, "is to really see the person you love, notice what they need, what they fear, what makes them happy, and then spend your life making sure they know they matter." Thomas took the advice to heart. He proposed to his sweetheart on a spring morning, and they were married that summer in a ceremony that brought together families from all over the territory. Grace cried happy tears throughout the entire event, and Violet held her hand, remembering their own simple wedding in Las Vegas. Thomas and his wife built a house on the far end of the ranch property, staying close to family while establishing their own home. A year later, they presented Violet and Grace with their first grandchild, a baby girl with Thomas's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes. Grace was a doting grandmother, and Violet found a whole new capacity for love opening up in his heart. Sarah eventually decided she wanted to study art in San Francisco, a decision that was hard for Grace and Violet to accept, but which they ultimately supported. They put her on the train with tears and prayers, trusting that they had raised her strong enough to navigate the world beyond their ranch. She wrote home every week, and her letters were full of excitement about her classes and her growing skill. As Violet and Grace moved into their 50s, they gradually handed over more responsibility to Thomas and the ranch hands. They still worked, still contributed, but they also took time to enjoy each other's company in ways they had been too busy for when the children were young. They took long rides together, spent afternoons reading side by side, and sometimes just sat on the porch watching the sun set over land they had worked so hard to build into something lasting. Sarah came home for holidays, bringing her finished paintings and stories about city life. She never married, pursuing her art with single-minded dedication, but she was happy in a way that made Grace and Violet proud. She eventually opened a gallery in San Francisco, but maintained a studio on the ranch, splitting her time between two worlds. Thomas and his wife had 3 more children, filling the ranch with noise and laughter again. Violet loved being a grandfather, teaching his grandchildren to ride and rope, telling them stories about the old days. Grace baked cookies and made quilts, spoiling her grandchildren just as much as Violet did. One evening, when Violet was 62 and Grace was 60, they sat together on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard while Thomas oversaw some fence repairs in the distance. The house they had built stood solid behind them, and the land they had cultivated stretched out in all directions. "You ever think about that night in the saloon?" Grace asked quietly. "All the time," Violet admitted. "I think about how close I came to not going in, to just heading home. I almost rode straight past Las Vegas that day." "What made you stop?" Grace asked. Violet considered the question. "I think some part of me knew I needed to be there, knew something important was waiting for me. I have never believed in fate, but that night I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." "I am glad you stopped," Grace said, reaching for his hand. "I am glad you saw me, truly saw me, and cared enough to do something about it." "I could not look away," Violet said. "The way you saved that last bite, the dignity you held onto even when everything else was falling apart. I knew right then that you were extraordinary." "I did not feel extraordinary," Grace said. "I felt like I was drowning, barely keeping my head above water." "But you were still swimming," Violet pointed out. "You had not given up. You were trying so hard to survive with grace and dignity intact. That takes strength most people do not have." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the sun paint the clouds in shades of gold and pink. "You know what I think about? I think about all the times you made sure I had enough food, how you always gave me the bigger portion or saved me the last slice. At first, I thought you were just being polite, but then I realized it was your way of loving me. Every extra biscuit, every full plate, every time you went hunting and brought back more than we needed, you were telling me without words that I mattered, that I was worth taking care of." "You did matter," Violet said. "You do matter. Grace, you are the center of everything I have built. This ranch, our family, the life we have created. It all started because I wanted to make sure you never went hungry again." "And I never have," Grace said softly. "Not once in almost 40 years. You have kept your promise, Violet Ashford." They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. Their grandchildren were called inside by their mother for supper, and Thomas waved to his parents before heading to his own house. Lights began to glow in windows across the property, marking the homes of the people who lived and worked there. "We built something good here," Violet said. "Something that will last beyond us." "We did," Grace agreed. "And it all started with a last bite of biscuit and a kind heart." Violet pulled her close, and they sat together watching the stars come out one by one over the desert they had made their home. He thought about the young cowboy he had been, eating alone and working himself to exhaustion just to keep the ranch running. He thought about the desperate young woman who had saved her last bite even as she starved. And he marveled at how 2 lost souls had found each other and built something beautiful from their shared determination to survive and thrive. The years continued to pass, gentler now, marked by grandchildren's birthdays and harvest seasons, by quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. Violet's hair turned completely white, and Grace moved a bit slower than she once had, but their love remained as strong as ever. They still held hands when they walked, still sought each other out during the day just to share a moment of connection. When Violet was 70, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For 2 weeks, he hovered between life and death while Grace sat at his bedside, refusing to leave, refusing to accept that their story might end this way. She fed him broth when he could swallow, bathed his fevered face with cool water, and talked to him constantly, reminding him of all the reasons he needed to fight. "You promised me," she said fiercely one night when his breathing was at its worst. "You promised I would always have more than enough, and I am not ready to have enough of you yet. I need more years, Violet. I need more mornings waking up beside you and more evenings watching the sunset together. So you fight, do you hear me? You fight to come back to me." Whether it was her determination or simple good fortune, Violet began to improve. His fever broke, his lungs cleared, and slowly, painfully, he recovered. It took months for him to regain his strength, but Grace was with him every step of the way, encouraging and supporting and loving him back to health. "You saved my life," Violet said when he was finally well enough to sit on the porch again. "You saved mine first," Grace replied. "I was just returning the favor." They lived another 15 years together, years that were precious because they both understood how finite time was. They watched their grandchildren grow up and start families of their own. They saw Sarah's art become famous enough that a museum in San Francisco devoted an entire exhibition to her work. They celebrated 58 years of marriage surrounded by 3 generations of family who existed because 2 people had been brave enough to reach out to each other. Violet Ashford died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85, with Grace holding his hand just as she had held it for nearly 6 decades. The ranch mourned the loss of its patriarch, but they also celebrated a life well lived and love well expressed. Grace lived 2 more years, staying on the ranch that had been her salvation and her joy. She spent her days with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about Violet and their life together. She made sure everyone understood the significance of that first night in the saloon, of what it meant to truly see someone and care enough to help. "Your grandfather taught me that love is not just words," she would say. "It is action. It is noticing what someone needs and providing it without being asked. It is keeping promises and building security and making sure the people you care about never have to face the world alone." When Grace passed away quietly in her sleep, she was buried next to Violet on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Her children placed wildflowers on the grave, the same desert flowers that had amazed her when Violet first brought her to the canyon spring all those years ago. The ranch continued, passed down through Thomas and eventually his children, a legacy of hard work and love that stretched back to a moment of connection in a Las Vegas saloon. And whenever new members joined the family, whether by birth or marriage, someone would tell them the story of how it all began, with a starving young woman who saved her last bite, and a kind cowboy who promised she would never have to go hungry again. It was a promise that echoed through generations, a reminder that love at its best is about seeing someone truly, caring deeply, and committing fully to their well-being and happiness. It was about noticing the small things and responding with generosity. It was about turning a desperate moment into a lifetime of abundance. And in the end, that promise of more than enough became the foundation not just of a marriage or a family, but of a legacy that lasted far beyond the 2 people who started it all. Because Violet Ashford had seen Grace Jennings at her lowest moment and chose kindness. Because Grace Jennings had accepted that kindness and transformed it into strength. Because together, they proved that sometimes the most profound love stories begin with the smallest act of noticing and caring. Their story lived on in every meal shared, every hand extended to help, every promise kept, reminding everyone who heard it that real love is measured not in grand gestures but in daily acts of ensuring that those we love always have more than enough.